Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Egan. I am the communications, or I should say, community relations officer here at TEMA. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me fine and that you can see myself. And you can also see Kate Amaral, who's with Nick, and we'll get to them in just a second. If anyone has any issues, we do have the chat open. So if you want to make a comment or anything in there, go ahead and do that. And then as this conversation continues, feel free to make any comments or put in any questions, and we will make sure that Kate and Nick get those questions. So just to start off real quick, it's National Volunteer Week, and we know that volunteers play a critical role in supporting disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. And it's really a coordinated effort that is key in supporting our local and state authorities for an effective response when needed the most. We see it often, severe weather happens, a disaster occurs. People instantly want to help, want to donate, want to get to where they need to be. But as we've seen oftentimes, we ask them to not go as quickly, to not self-deploy, and to make sure that everyone is prepared ahead of time and understands how that volunteer effort works internally with our partners and then how they can help. So we really hope that this webinar will help trying to get that information out, whether that you've been involved for many years, whether you would just like to get involved, or you don't know how to tell your community members how to get involved. We hope that this conversation will help in that regard. So I'm going to introduce our two representatives that are here for this conversation today, and I'm so grateful that they have offered to be our guinea pig for this webinar series, as we hope to do more of these here at TEMA. But we have Kate Amaral, who's the non-governmental partnerships manager here at TEMA, and she's joined by Nick Gow, who's the president of Tennessee Voluntary Organizations in Disaster, who TEMA works very closely with in disaster response and recovery. So I'm going to have them both introduce themselves real quick.
Hi, everybody. Kate Amaral, really glad you guys are here today. As Melissa said, I'm the non-governmental partnerships manager here at TEMA, which means that I work with volunteers, nonprofits, donations, and private sector, and put all of those things together for the good of the community. So really what my job is about partnerships and how we can leverage all of those for communities before, during, and after disaster. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I'm Nick. In my 9-to-5 job, I'm a pro bono attorney that specializes in disaster recovery. So my passion is advocating for disaster survivors and meeting their unmet legal needs. One of the best ways that I've found to do that is by supporting the Tennessee VOAD, which is a group of all of the volunteer organizations across Tennessee who activate during disasters and serve disaster survivors. And so through my advocacy work for those survivors, I've found that supporting those organizations and making sure that they can serve their mission as best they can goes a really long way toward improving the service toward those survivors.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. And as I mentioned earlier, we want this really to be an informal conversation. If you have questions or comments, please feel comfortable with putting them in the chat. We are hoping to limit this to 30 minutes. So we're going to move through a lot of topics really quickly. But if you have any questions, I will be monitoring the chat so we can get them to Kate and Nick as the conversation continues. And then if we have time remaining at the end, we will get to any questions that folks may still have. So we're going to start it very general here, and I'm going to start with you, Kate. What roles do volunteers typically play before, during, and after disasters here in Tennessee?
Absolutely. And I love this question because volunteers come in all types of varieties, right? So when we're talking about before disasters, we see volunteers, across the space, everywhere from first responders. We have volunteer fire departments, volunteer rescue squads. We have, and those are highly trained individuals. We have folks that volunteer with, their faith-based organization, whether it's to man a shelter or, just put together a meal train for somebody. Tennessee is very, very blessed to have a very robust volunteer spirit. And I love that that's kind of the title of this webinar. But so before disasters, we see a lot of volunteers that organize, to train and to prepare, especially with their emergency management agencies. And again, that can be serving all different types of roles, whether it be feeding people, housing people. It could be that debris removal, mucking gut, kind of getting dirty situation. But that is a lot of times organized through our CERT teams, our community emergency response teams. And that effort is headed up by Volunteer Tennessee here in the state. And so we do see a lot of our communities that have that. During disasters, I'll say that we see a lot of neighbors helping neighbors. One of the things that brought me back to Tennessee, I was born and raised here, left for a while, and then came back because of that spirit of helping our neighbor. So immediately after a disaster, we see that happen a lot. A lot of your first response is that, that neighbor that checks on somebody else to make sure that they're okay. And that's, probably the most important role that people fill. And then, after a disaster, we see people to, come together to clean up communities, whether that's through organized volunteer efforts or, again, neighbor helping neighbor. So, we see that go through our long-term recovery groups and can last, years, sometimes decades, when we look at some of the bigger disasters that have happened, that just keep showing up in their community and keep standing in there for, their neighbors, their loved ones, and, all those involved. So it's very, the jobs are varied. Again, we see what we call unskilled volunteers. So people who, want to get out there and clean up. They want to get out there and, just pull debris to the curb. They want to get out there and put a tarp on a roof. To people who are, hey, I'm going to volunteer my time as an accountant to help somebody with their taxes. I mean, we see that specialized care too. So there's all types of ways that people can volunteer for sure.
And Nick, I think this goes right into the next question for you here is, how does Tennessee VOAD coordinate those efforts across the state in times of disasters? We often see people, they want to help, but we know that the coordinated effort's the best. How does VOAD put that all together? What don't people see behind the scenes as a disaster occurs?
So there's a huge amount of administrative coordination and cooperation that goes into serving survivors. We've found that one of the best things that we as an organization can do for survivors is work towards making sure that the service that they're getting, despite it being volunteer-led service, is a reliable, consistent, and professional service. And that really eases a lot of the anxiety and a lot of the unsureness and unknowns that survivors face. So bringing together our members so that they can collaborate, communicate, cooperate about what they're doing, where they're doing it, the gaps that they're seeing in our survivors' needs, and what they're seeing could improve the service is crucial. So all coming together and working towards that, putting together consistent messaging, putting together consistent platforms for people to go to, and just overall really making the service towards those survivors as coherent and professional as possible is kind of our goal.
So what can people do in advance now, either individuals or organizations or groups, to prepare to volunteer rather than waiting for that disaster to occur? Are there any training, certifications, or steps that people can take now?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a huge amount of kind of prep work that can go into the idea of responding in your community in times of disaster. And the more you can do, the better, because disaster response and recovery is owned by communities. Once upon a time, the idea was that, professionals from across the nation would come in and take over and they would just run everything. And we found a long time ago that that just does not work as well as empowering and lifting up the local communities to own it themselves, because they know their community, they know the needs, they know the impacts. And so now the idea is that we come in and we lift them up. And so when you're doing your blue sky work on how to serve your community, start with your community. And that looks different across Tennessee. So for instance, in places like Nashville and Clarksville, they have landing pages like Nashville Responds and CMC Responds, where people can go and they can volunteer and they can register. If you're from a smaller community in Tennessee, it might be a smaller network. It might be your local church. It might be, and for instance, in Hurricane Helene, we saw one of the most active disaster response volunteer organizations was the Northeast Second Harvest Food Bank, which was kind of, surprising to us, but they were hugely involved and their volunteer pool was hugely involved. And so finding that active volunteer organization in your community during blue sky times is really important. And then getting ingratiated with that organization before a disaster is also hugely important, because they're all going to have different systems to kind of become familiar with you, to become familiar with what you have to offer disaster survivors, and to be confident and know what it is that they can rely on you for. So I really can't undersell the scope of how much you can put into getting prepared to do volunteer work in your community. There are also plenty of programs, like FEMA has the CERT program. They also have an individual study program that you could just spend hours learning about what disaster response and volunteer work looks like.
And Kate, during a disaster, I know I've seen you in there for many, many hours. We're in the State Emergency Operations Center together. Um, how does the state and across the board ensure that volunteers are effectively integrated into these emergency response plans, other than, responding to individual needs that may arise? How are those plans made with these volunteers preparing for the next disaster?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely one that I could spend a whole lot of time talking about, but we we only have a little bit of time today. But you know, everything starts with a plan, right? So as we TEMA go through and write disaster plans as a state, we look at how our voluntary organizations active in disaster, our VOAD, can contribute to that, right? Because we recognize that not all communities have the same resources. And so Nick was talking about empowering our communities by bringing these volunteer organizations in that do this on a regular basis. It helps fill those gaps. So we look at how we can effectively plug people in. So it's, everybody knows, like, for sheltering, they think of the American Red Cross, right? So they think of that automatic kind of that brand recognition. But what happens when we need to expand that? So, let's think about if we needed to shelter a large amount of people, what other groups can we bring to the table? So we really look at that and break it down. There's a whole lot of communication that happens internally during the plan writing phase. And then we branch out. After that, we exercise with those groups. We have some exercises coming up that will be including some of our volunteer organizations, even if it's just for them to observe and tell us how they can plug in, right? Because we don't always know. So there's a lot of that in the planning and training. And then when we actually get to disaster, there are a lot of, I want to say, one-off unmet needs, but we also look at how can we utilize our nonprofit organizations to take the pressure off of a community and lift up that community, but also save that community money. So let's use an example. If we have a community that, they have a lot of search and rescue going on, they have a lot of first responders out there, there's a huge need to feed people, they've got folks in shelter, we're going to rely on one of our feeding partners. So, Operation Barbecue Relief, Tennessee Baptist, I'm going to leave somebody out, they're going to get really mad, but Mercy Chefs, we have a ton of those feeding partners, and we're going to call them and say, hey, this community has this issue. They're looking at, needing feeding for first responders, volunteers, and those folks go out there and they do an amazing job. Not only does it allow them to connect with that community and provide hope, but it also allows them to relieve some of the financial burden for that community. Because if it's just one community that's affected, we may not get a declaration, right? So we look at that in a multidisciplinary approach, and all the time are looking to plan that, train that, push that out to our communities, make those connections. That's one of the things that I do is I introduce these volunteer groups to our local communities that may not have heard of them before, and show them ways to get plugged in. So yes, a lot of it happens during disaster time, but we prefer it happen before if possible.
So now we're going to kind of move into disaster. We've covered the before, how people can get involved ahead of time. Now we're going to be in the thick of it here. And this question's for both of you guys. What are the biggest challenges when it comes to coordinating volunteers and efforts in the first hours or days after a severe weather incident or a disaster?
We both look at each other and go, oh. No, that's a great question. And, I'm going to kind of throw it back to an experience we had in Cookeville, Tennessee, March 3rd, 2020 tornadoes. The very next day, there were thousands of people that showed up to help folks clean up. And I can tell you, the community was so grateful for every single person that showed up, but we didn't have anywhere to put that many people at one time. So I think one of the greatest challenges that we have are people who are willing to go out there, who want to be a part of the process, but may not understand that life safety hasn't been completed yet. This was one of the things that we saw during Hurricane Helene. We did not, and when I say we, I mean the emergency management community as a whole, we were still out there rescuing people. There was still accountability happening. There was still a missing persons list. And we had folks out there, that were trying to help. And absolutely, we want people to help their neighbor. Absolutely. I'm not saying that we don't, but we had no way of accounting for those folks. We had no way of knowing who was a volunteer, who, is a community member, who's a survivor. Ensuring that those folks can volunteer in a safe environment is also very important. We don't want anybody getting hurt, but most especially when it's the hours after a disaster, we don't know if the scene is safe yet. So there's a lot that plays into it. So I would say safety is huge. Accountability for persons is huge. We don't want anybody else getting hurt. And then ensuring that we respect the survivor, right? So we respect that individual's right to their privacy when it comes to their things. So I always use the example of, we see on social media or, your chosen media, you'll see, footage of house fire, for instance, or you'll see disaster survivors, like they'll have footage of cleanup, like after a hurricane, right? And you just see piles of stuff everywhere. Those piles of stuff are somebody's life, right? So we want to respect that homeowner who may not be ready for somebody to clean up their property yet. So those are the biggest challenges that I see. I'm sure Nick has more.
No, I think the patience and the not self-deployment certainly is the primary one, and I would echo all that. The other really common one and like most broad one that I see is just generally um, survivors, volunteers, and the public in general really lose perspective on the difficulty and the scope of getting these jobs and these missions done. These volunteers are deployed to do a specific mission, accomplish a specific project, and the fact that this is being accomplished with unpaid volunteer labor does not make these goals and these projects any less difficult. These are still major undertakings by these organizations with big goals and big scopes of service with tons of moving parts. And people lose track of that, and they get this feeling that because they're volunteering and because their labor is free, they should be able to just jump in and do as they please and help in the way that they see. And the unfortunate truth is that just breeds chaos and disservice to survivors. I really encourage anybody thinking about volunteering in times of disaster or at all to really maintain that perspective that it's still a job. You're still there to accomplish a job. There's going to be somebody managing it. There's going to be somebody leading it. And it's important that they, know what they can count on from you and that they can count on you to get it done. And also just give them the deference and the latitude to accomplish that job and that project in a professional way. People think that just because it's unpaid labor that there are less moving parts. Oh, you're not tracking time, you're not tracking paying people. In and of itself is a misconception. A lot of organizations that do volunteer projects are tracking time and are tracking labor for the sake of back end stuff, the administrative pieces. I know a lot of our member organizations, if they did want having to pay people, they probably could because they do track those numbers and those missions in such a professional way to accomplish those goals. And I think people just lose perspective on that. So treat it as a job, treat it as a professional undertaking, and know that that's the scope of things that are being done. And I also wanted to throw out, we're talking about registration and organizations, and we've talked about a few brands. And there would be a couple that I'd just kind of be remiss if they didn't get brought up that I wanted to mention before we move on. Team Rubicon is another really great one if you have any volunteers that really want to kind of put their back into it and do some of that, like debris management, clearing roadways, things like that. We've already mentioned the Second Harvest Food Bank is a really great organization across the state of Tennessee. They all have their individual chapters, but in our experience, all of them are really, really great valuable partners in times of disaster and in blue sky times. The United Ways across Tennessee tend to be very active in blue sky and gray sky times. And then, of course, we have Volunteer Tennessee, which is an initiative that First Lady Lee is involved in, and they run volunteer initiatives in blue sky and gray sky times as well, and they're very valuable to our friends over at the government.
Are there any particular roles or needs that are often in short supply during disaster response efforts? We usually, I know on my avenue, we usually see people saying we're collecting bottled water, or we're doing this, or we're doing that. What are like the roles or needs that you see on your end, as in we need more of this? We wish people knew, hey, we'd rather X over Y, or is that even a thing?
My answer's short. I'm going to go back to my blue sky thing. One that's really in demand is the people who know their organizations, who like have the reputation and have done the legwork and can lead because of that. That know how things work, and that the organizations don't have to stop everything, bring them up to speed, bring them up to training. Those are the really, really valuable volunteers that can jump in with a clipboard and start sending people where they need to go, start doing the trainings, start doing the organization and that administrative work that people look over. To my mind, regardless of skill set, regardless of past, those volunteers who have put in the legwork in blue sky times and know the process ahead of time are by far and away the most valuable volunteers for that response phase.
As far as roles that are in short supply, I think, statewide, one of the things that we see, people who have organizational skills, right? So I think about what happens when I live in a small community. So what happens when, tractor trailer loads of supplies start showing up in my community, right? Someone who is organized, like Nick said, somebody who's not afraid to step up and lead, to say, okay, this is how we're going to handle this, to be able to communicate effectively with emergency management and local officials. I think, those people are always definitely needed. However, um, I I don't overlook the need for more mental health volunteers in this space, as we see more and more disasters happening, not just in Tennessee, but everywhere. Um, we see the need for a greater, just a greater number of mental health professionals willing to volunteer their time, but also for spiritual and emotional care. So you don't have to be, a psychologist or a counselor to be able to participate in that space, but your church group might be willing to, host a community prayer night, or go around and just love on people. And that is one of the great things about Tennessee, is that we have a lot of organizations and churches and across all faiths that are willing to come together and support people. I think we need that more, because a lot of people are out there hurting and they might not understand the process, but being able to provide that light and that hope for people is really, really important.
And we have about 5 minutes left. I do have one more question that we will kind of wrap it up with. And then again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the chat. First, before we get to the last question, we did get a comment, and Kate, I'm thinking this is your job that you're working on. Keith just said that local emergency management agencies that are present, if they can identify a more robust list of active volunteer agencies in their basic emergency ops plan, that would aid their local communities, because building those relationships with volunteer agencies and messaging in the local communities would make coordination and managing volunteer efforts during disasters more streamlined. And I'm sure that both of you can agree.
Oh yeah, no, I totally agree with Keith. And Keith and I have probably actually had that conversation as well. But yes, I completely agree with that. I think the one caveat that we have to keep in mind with all things volunteer, if the disaster is large, and I'm going to use Hurricane Helene as an example, if we have a situation like Hurricane Helene, there are going to be organizations that we know are going to show up. Those are Tennessee VOAD organizations that we work with every day. We know those folks are going to be there. But there's a larger umbrella of national VOAD partners as well that is bigger than our state VOAD. That they may not have a foothold in Tennessee, but they may come in as well. And so we know who those partners are. but there are going to be volunteer groups that spring up. It could be an HOA group that we've never, or the Spring Street Baptist Church or the First Presbyterian, they just decide to get together and go out there. Or, we've seen like our Lions clubs, our Rotary clubs get together and go out and to do cleanup. It's harder to kind of keep to know who those groups are. And so I would encourage, if you're a local emergency manager, or if you're an organization that you're like, hey, we would like to do that, get together with your emergency management folks in your county and say, hey, I go to, the church here on the corner. We have a group of people who are interested in, learning how to help during a disaster. And that EMA group is going to point you in the right direction. There's training out there, like we've mentioned, the CERT training. They may already have a local or county VOAD. We do have several of those in Tennessee that they can plug you into. Communicate with your emergency managers. They're there for that purpose, to help you find that avenue to volunteer. Sorry, I probably took all of your 5 minutes with that, but no, Keith and I are on the same page.
No, you have 2 minutes left.
As well. That's one of our enumerated goals for 2025, is to increase our partnership and visibility with local emergency managers. And I personally will be at their conference next week to try and discuss with them more ways that we can build those relationships and those partnerships.
All right, I'm going to ask this one last question. So if you do have a hard out at 2:30, feel free to leave. You won't hurt our feelings. But I think this is a good last question. And then if you have any more comments, feel free to leave them in the chat. What lessons have been learned from recent disasters in Tennessee that are shaping how volunteers are used moving forward?
I'll start from kind of the government side of things, and I can use some specific examples 100%. So I think one of the lessons that we have learned, there is no disaster season in Tennessee anymore. Like, all year is disaster season. So we don't necessarily sit here and go, oh, it's tornado season, so we only have to worry in this time. I think, we as Tennesseans are prepared all the time. One of the ways that we are prepared is in our communities that have gone through a disaster. I'll use, Nashville, Cookeville, Clarksville. These folks already have either long-term recovery groups or city and county voluntary organizations active in disaster. Communities that have these organizations established and that keep them going are quicker to recover after subsequent disasters. So we have learned, and we're partnering with VOAD, and we have been for a few years, to help build those relationships. So, perfect example, the West Tennessee Regional VOAD and the Shelby County VOAD were both very active during the flooding that happened at the beginning of the month. And we're able to meet a lot of those needs at the local level. They didn't need help from the state VOAD partners because they had built those relationships at the local level. So, building out those organizations in more of a localized way is amazing. It helps recovery go faster. It also helps bring in the public. So it helps, make more stakeholders in that local area part of the process, which is what we love to see. Recovery is led by the community, as Nick said. And so, it's not led by the state, it's not led by the federal government, it's led by the local municipality. And in order for them to own their recovery, they need to be empowered. And that's what we're here to do. So I would say, from the recent disasters, we've learned that those communities that have either faced a disaster, have partnered with a neighboring community who has faced a disaster, and they already have those groups established, are recovering quicker and are more resilient because of it. So I think that's the one thing I've learned.
Wow. I think from a VOAD perspective, the kind of most valuable lesson that we've learned is that Tennesseans are going to volunteer. There is going to be a turnout of volunteers for
100%.
And there needs to be a structure to coordinate and manage those volunteers. And the secondary and arguably more important lesson there that we've learned is that coordinating and managing those volunteers is not a small ask. It's not a small job. It's not something that can be taken lightly or taken for granted in a community, especially in some of these smaller communities that get hit with really significant incidents. It's something that the local community needs support on, needs understanding, and needs the cooperation of the volunteers. So that's what we've learned, is that the volunteers are unstoppable. They're going to show up, and there needs to be a system to manage and coordinate them, and that system needs to be robust and well supported.
All right. Well, I think those are all the questions I have. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and put up our or not conversations, some contact information on the screen while I have y'all just wrap anything up. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the group that joined us today?
Yeah, I just want to say, if you are out there in a community and you have been volunteering, thank you. Even if you have just taken one afternoon to go out and help your neighbor, that's the most important thing that you can do, is to serve others. And so during this National Volunteer Month, the National Volunteer Week, I want to say thank you for being those volunteers that are out there in the space doing good things and bringing hope to people every day.
I don't know that I can say it any better than that.
All right, well, let me stop sharing my screen. And I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us. This is the first webinar of hopefully many here at TEMA. We are hopefully going to start a monthly webinar open to local emergency management professionals, all of our state partners, and to Tennesseans. So keep an eye out on our socials. We hope to do one every month that is relevant to the time of the year and what is going on at that time. And if you have any suggestions on topics that you'd like to hear more about, or things that maybe you would like to share from your organizations, you can feel free to reach out to me. And other than that, I just want to say thank you. It looks like you guys were enjoying that conversation a bit. So if you need anything, you can reach out to me and I can connect you with Kate and Nick, or I also just showed their contact information. But just again, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your Thursday.
Bye, everybody.